what we're trying to emphasise is that the right mix and quantities of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium and sulphur are critical if we're going to maximise yields and return on fertiliser investment. We're seeing a lot of evidence of fertiliser or dollars that are being invested in the wrong mix of products, or increasing rates of one particular product when the yield's been constrained by another one. So getting that mix right is important, and I'll give you some examples. What we're talking about, those of you who have heard us talk before have heard us talk about deep placement, particularly of things like phosphorus and potassium. What I want to emphasise in this take-home message is we're not saying deep placement at the expense of starter fertilisers. Yeah, starter P and zinc have got a specific purpose, they are needed, and we don't want you to stop using them. We want you to do some things in addition to what you're doing already. Periodic additions of P and K may be needed at specific times in the crop cycle. And they should be roughly in the middle of that 10 to 30 centimetre layer if you can get them there, because that's where most of our net depletion is going on. The impact of that deep placement will vary with seasonal conditions. And I guess the last 12 months have been some pretty good examples where it's as wet as the proverbial. You don't live in that 30 centimetre layer too often because there's no oxygen down there. So you need, but then the following season we'll be living in subsoil moisture and those reserves become absolutely critical. And I guess the good thing is that the residual value we're seeing ensures that the benefits that your fertiliser you put on this year will be found in the next 3 to 5 years without any doubt at all. I guess the other thing is that the inputs of more mobile nutrients like nitrogen and sulphur can be done on a seasonal basis, such as we're doing now, to match yield targets. But the important thing is you've got to set up that P and K in the background so that you can achieve that seasonal water-limited yield potential. The Field Research Program, it's been a big program, running from Capella to Gunnedah, covering winter and summer crops in addition to cotton. And the two main questions, and I've probably got them back to front in this slide, is are P, K or S combinations limiting yield potential in those cropping systems? And if they are, how do you apply P or K in particular to get the best response? The P and K placement work features typically bands that are either 1 metre, 50 centimetres or 25 centimetres apart, and either what we're calling shallow, which is about the normal fertiliser band depth now, and deep, which is around about 20 centimetres, or a combination of the two. Where we've got sites, and this has probably been a relatively recent addition where we're looking at the interactions between phosphorus, potassium and sulphur, we've settled on a single band spacing, which has been about 50 centimetres, and we've got our applications a combination of shallow and deep, because we're trying to look at which nutrients are limiting at those sites rather than what's the optimum placement strategy. We've also got irrigated cotton sites at Collarenbri and Warra, and the Warra site looks at banding versus mixing of particularly phosphorus and potassium, and Collie has a comparison of liquid versus granular P. As I said, we've got this last winter we had 9 sites. We had 8 wheat and 1 barley. Unfortunately, the barley site at Garra, just when we were getting close to harvest, was submerged and didn't come out for a fair while, so we lost that one. This summer, we've had 7 trials in cotton. We've got 10 trials in sorghum, most of which are off now, with one exception. 2 in maize and 1 in mung bean. And the trials are a mix of new and carryover trials to look at residual benefits. And that last bit's really, really important, because if we're going to go to all the trouble of deep placing fertiliser, we've got to know how long it's going to last in the cropping cycle, because that's what determines the economics of that operation. Let's go to the broad issues, and you've seen me use this barrel, I think, in the last summer updates. The main nutritional limit we've got in our cropping system is nitrogen. It's generally the plank that's lowest in the barrel. That's the thing that's restricting us from achieving our water-limited yield potential. And we've traditionally responded by putting on nitrogen fertiliser to get there, in addition to perhaps some starter P and maybe zinc to get our yield potential right. And so, by and large, that relationship still holds. Nitrogen is the predominant limit. But what we're often finding is that when we put nitrogen on, instead of getting up to our water limited yield potential, we're actually only getting to the phosphorus or the potassium or the sulfur limited yield potential, which is some fraction of it. And that means that in essence, we're basically wasting water and we're wasting dollars invested in nitrogen fertiliser because we can't get here. All we can do is get to the next most limiting nutrient in that cascade. And so what's often happened is that we find a situation where we apply nitrogen fertiliser to match the yield potential, the water limited yield potential. We don't achieve it. We don't achieve it consistently. And so we reduce our target yields for that paddock by saying, well, it must be just an ordinary paddock. And so we back off on our nitrogen fertiliser rates and we lock into a low yield, low water use efficiency future for that paddock because we've matched these two levels, but we're wasting water because we're getting nowhere near the water limited yield potential for that field. What in fact we're advocating is that we address that PKS limitation so that we can then match water and nitrogen to achieve our water limited yield potential in any given season. A classic example of that's from the summer in 2010-11. I showed this in the summer updates. It was from sorghum work done by Trevor Philp and the Pax Seeds team up in Capella. And as you can see, this was the sorghum yield, about 2.5 tonnes with no fertiliser, which was the farmer practice at that block. A large amount of nitrogen fertiliser applied took you a little bit higher, about another 0.5 tonne. Putting extra phosphorus with the nitrogen, extra potassium with the nitrogen took you a little bit each time. And then you added sulphur and bingo, we've got potentially now a 2 tonne yield difference in yield potential or a 70% yield increase by getting that right combination. Now, the critical step was adding the sulphur. I'm not saying that sulphur alone delivered the 70% yield response, but if you didn't have sulphur in that paddock, all the other nutrients were wasted because you couldn't, sulphur was the main limiting factor that was limiting yield. Everything else was in excess and couldn't be utilised. So what did we see last winter? Well, we saw some big yield increases relative to standard commercial practice. We're talking 15 to 80% yield increases from trial to trial, or 400 kilos to well over 2 tonnes in terms of wheat yield increase. Some of the sites were limited by nitrogen availability. In other words, nitrogen was still the most limiting nutrient at that site, and whatever else we did was immaterial because we were still running at that nitrogen limited yield potential. And one of those was a double crop field at Goondiwindi, and the other one was up in Goondiwindi, where a very wet summer and a low nitrogen input for that season meant that anything that affected nitrogen availability was what drove yield. But in the other sites we got consistent P responses, often much greater than what we would have got with starter P alone. And P was the main response. We got a smaller additional responses to adding potassium and or sulphur to that phosphorus. And I think this is the sites at Brookstead. You can see the sorts of yield responses we're getting, in this case to P and S. And you can see here as you're going down the rows, when you get out of the background P and S treatments, in there you can see how the crop drops away. And I'll show you the yield data from that field in a minute. So let's look at the site at Goondiwindi. This is what the crop looked like in 2010. Patches of acute K deficiency in that field. We put 200 units of K into that field. And we got some tremendous yield responses. We're looking to follow that through the subsequent seasons. We got great responses in 2010, 2011. Everything was driven by nitrogen. That's biomass nitrogen at flowering, grain yield. So anything that affected nitrogen availability was what was driving grain yield. Potassium had nothing to do with it. So in some of those treatments we had some manures. We put different rates of DAP and MAP to get phosphorus in there. And the nitrogen that we added in those treatments was what drove yield. And so we didn't see any responses to potassium in that particular season because nitrogen was the main limit. And as you can see here, some of the grain proteins in those treatments were down at 7%. The best we got at the trial was 9%. And so we were acutely nitrogen deficient at that site, even though we got the highest yields in the trial were 4.5 tonne. Strong responses to extra phosphorus. Now this extra phosphorus is either deep, shallow or the combination of the two. Now the numbers in brackets here are the number of crop years we've got at those particular sites. There's a site at Wandally here, no P input at all, no starter P, the addition of starter P in red and the extra P shallow and deep in the blue. And so you can see some fairly consistent effects in the third crop year. In the case of Brookstead, we didn't have no P alone, it was just starter or starter with extra P. And that's the 6th crop year now. We've had 5 sorghum crops and a wheat crop at that site, so there's still, those effects are still going. Another site at Brookstead, slightly smaller response, and a site at Brigalow. It's interesting when you look at when we've got the extra P in that system, there's a fairly similar sort of yield being obtained across all those sites, sort of 4.5 tonnes or thereabouts. But some of the losses in these sites down here, 1.5 tonne, there's some big yield reductions. Those sites may also have some slight S and K limitations as well, because we haven't backgrounded out those other nutrients. Now, any factor that reduced root system effectiveness accentuated the responses. Now, what I'm showing you here is 2 trials on block side by side at Brookstead. The trial in red is double cropped after sorghum, very low nematode population. The trial in blue was cropped after a failed chickpea crop, and the lesion nematode numbers were somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000. I'm not going to embarrass myself by saying per kilo or 200 mil per kilo. So we would expect significant nutrient limitations, nematode limitations at that site. If you look at that blue site, where we had starter P alone, we put extra P and S in at 20 centimetres or so prior to sowing, and then extra P, S and K, we were looking at over 2 tonne yield responses at that site. Same field next door, well, the adjoining field next door, you see the starter P alone, we had a more effective root system, we were more effectively able to forage for P, K and S in very similar soil conditions. We still got responses, but nowhere near to the same extent. The big difference here is what the root system was able to achieve under conditions of pretty sparse nutrient supply. So nematodes with knocking your root system around increase the nutrient requirement. Same sort of thing when you've got very wet soil. These are sorghum crops at Goondiwindi in 2010-11. That's without K and S in the background, with K and S in the background, and the colours are red is 25 centimetre P bands, yellow is 50 centimetre P bands, and the bluish colour is metre P bands. You can see in that wet year, wide bands didn't give us as good effect, and we got a general increase in yield when we added K and S to that site. Most of that was due to K. This season, when it hasn't been anywhere near as wet, we got a very strong response primarily to S, to adding S into that system, but the band spacing didn't have as big an impact in this season. So again, anything that affects the root system's ability to get out and tap into a large volume of soil, the more that's affected, the higher the critical soil value becomes, or the bigger the fertiliser response becomes. Band spacing and positional effects. Fairly consistent responses to band spacing for P. 25 and 50 centimetres are more effective than a metre. The depth response vary a bit. This is stuff from Brookstead over 5 consecutive sorghum crops. Starter P alone, shallow P or deep P. You can see in some years deep P is significantly better than shallow. In other years there's not a lot of difference between deep and shallow, and that just depends on where the root systems are operating in that season. It's early days for cotton. We've only had last season and this season in the field. We had some dryland sites in northern New South Wales that were a bit short of N and a bit stressed last year, and some of our Queensland sites partially drowned. Some of our New South Wales sites have drowned this year, and some of the Queensland ones are doing quite nicely. So he does go around. But that's the sort of variability that water lying in paddocks can induce. It's pretty hard to sort of pick out PK and S responses against that background. But the collie site showed a nice additive effect of P and S in terms of cotton yield at that particular instance, and we saw a similar thing at Brigalow. So to summarise, soil and seasonal conditions are going to affect presence and severity of non-nitrogen limitations. We've got a long residual value of P and K, so if you don't use it this year, it's going to be there for next year, just like money in the bank. Additional P needs to be preferably in 50 centimetre bands or closer. We've got a bit more work to do with K yet. And I think the benefits of deep bands are proven. So how do we manage that in the cropping system? Well, our deep applications have to be when we've got little stubble or moisture to lose. We know the residual value is good, so we're coming in after a crop with not a lot of stubble, as these examples here. We can put our P and K in at that time. We've got no moisture to lose and potentially no stubble cover to lose. We set ourselves up for the next 4 to 5 crop seasons. We apply enough to match removal in the next 3 to 5 crops, and we maintain our use of starter P. The sorts of rates we've been using are 40 kilos of P. That set us up for these five seasons or so, which is a couple of 100 kilos of MOP. So I'll come back to the take-home messages. I think the mix is important and getting the right limiting component addressed. Don't forget the starter. But when we do put our extra additions of P and K in, try and get smack in the middle of that 10 to 30 centimetre band if you can. The impact's going to vary, but remember that it's money in the bank, so you're not going to lose it. And use the inputs of more mobile nutrients like N and S to match the seasonal yield potential. And just acknowledging particularly the help from Incitec Pivot, who lent us their fertiliser rig for the last couple of years to put down these trials, as well as the growers and advisors who put up with us interfering with their daily operations.
Good. Thanks, Mike.
With your deep banding, what's your thoughts on using a strip till situation for deep banding, particularly in a row?
Yeah, the critical issue is the volume of soil enriched, and so I guess we've been talking to people who are designing new feet and tines and things like that to try and can we compensate, for example, indirectly answering your question. Can we compensate? We know a 1 metre band in, say, a sorghum system doesn't give us enough volume enriched to do the job. So a strip till operation with that nutrient mixed through a wider band, yeah. What about a tine that's got some wings on it that can give us, say, a 15 centimetre band of enriched soil at the time? We're talking with some of you have probably seen some of the prototype tines that are being talked about at the moment that will allow us to do that sort of placement to give us that volume of enrichment. So there's a number of ways to skin a cat. Certainly strip till will work, yes.
Another question?
Mike, can you give us an indication of what levels of soil feed you're getting or not getting a response to the placement?
At the risk of taking anything away from Chris, who's going to talk about that critical range that we're using in a minute, most of these sites, the coral peas in the top 10 centimetres are generally under 25, and the coral peas again in the layers underneath are generally less than 10. Well, no, perhaps less than 15, I think. The BSES peas are, let's consider the subsoil. The BSES peas will typically be less than 30, perhaps even less than 25. So we're talking some fairly low situations, but I guess the point is that they're not unusual. And it's that if there's no coral down there, then the BSES peak becomes really critical, and there's a lot of soils that have got, once you get below the 0 to 10, this coral is less than detection limit. So we're talking about a large proportion of the crop area, particularly in parts of Queensland.
Another question?
Mike, is there any way to tell whether banding below the surface in a deep strip or broadcasting deep down is a better way to go? Like soil enrichment is one thing, but getting into that soil solutions and other things are the correct quantity?
Yes, you did right. So you're saying is a complete tillage better than banding? I guess we've taken the approach, we try and leave the surface on the surface and any stubble we can on the surface. We haven't seen any evidence yet to suggest that mixing is much better than, say, bands 25 to 30 centimetres apart. There's generally a small drop-off between 25 and 50 centimetre band spacings, but so small as to be probably insignificant, I suspect. The issue is interesting when you come to irrigated cotton, though, because there you've got a situation where a lot of the P and K is probably put in a single band and the hill pulled up on top of it. Now, I'd argue that particularly what we're seeing with phosphorus and the lack of P fixation in these soils, the good residual values, are we getting enough roots into that single band at the base of a cotton hill, and therefore would mixing it, broadcasting on the surface and pulling it into the hill mixed be a far better option than putting that single band? With the PBIs that we've got under, say 150, there's no reason why you wouldn't do that, and every reason to expect that you might get better P recovery out of it. The K we don't know yet, and that's the uncertain question, because K is the one, particularly in soils that have high CECs, where affecting that solution K concentration is pretty hard when you've got a huge background of calcium and magnesium and everything else there. And I think you'll hear more about that from Craig later on in the session.
One more quick question, and more importantly, one more quick answer.
Like in strongly cracking soils, when they're dry and really cracked, do you see any opportunity for getting fertiliser down the cracks?
You can. Do you get enough to make a difference, I guess is the question. I get the impression that when we see our best cracking is probably where we see our least root activity, is quite often in the wheel tracks and places like that, where you've got sort of poor structural issues to start with. And you tend to not enrich large proportions of the soil volume. It's worth a try, but I suspect it'll be a fraction of what you would get with properly placed bands. That'd be a gut feeling, we haven't really tried. I've certainly seen it tried with water run with potassium, and it hasn't done a very good job.
Thanks, Mike. Mike will be presenting in the second session later. Yeah, so if you've got any other questions, catch up with Mike then. So once again, thank Mike for his presentation.